When you look at a narcissist moving on quickly, posting happy photos, stepping into a new relationship, or acting as though nothing ever touched them, it can feel like they've won. Mercy. It can feel like all the love, effort, and emotional labor you gave meant nothing. But that perception is part of the illusion. Or see, what you are seeing is not fulfillment, it's performance. And this is where things begin to shift when we examine it through a psychological lens, much like the work of Dr. Ramani Durvasula often emphasizes. Narcissistic individuals are not driven by connection in the way emotionally healthy people are. They are driven by validation, admiration, and what we call supply. That means their sense of worth is externally regulated. It depends on applause, attention, and the constant reinforcement of their identity. So when they move on quickly, it's not because they've healed or processed anything, it's because they need a new source to stabilize that fragile sense of self. But here's the reality. Validation is not the same as fulfillment. It's fast, it's loud, and it's temporary. Fulfillment, on the other hand, is quiet, steady, and rooted in authenticity. And narcissists, by their very structure, struggle with authenticity because it requires vulnerability, accountability, and self-awareness, things they actively avoid. So what happens over time is a kind of emotional hollowness. They may collect experiences, people even admiration, but it doesn't land, it doesn't integrate, it doesn't nourish. It's like trying to fill a deep void with surface level moments. And no matter how much they accumulate, it never quite feels like enough. This is why you'll often see a pattern of escalation. The next relationship has to be more exciting. The next achievement has to be more visible. The next validation hit has to be stronger because the previous ones didn't actually satisfy anything lasting. It's not growth, it's compensation. This is where it becomes important for you, especially if you were the one who gave deeply, who showed up with empathy and consistency. You were offering something real. You are offering connection, presence, and emotional depth. But those are things a narcissist often cannot fully receive, let alone reciprocate. So when you're no longer there, it's not that you were easily replaced. It's that what you offered cannot be replaced in the same way. What looks like them thriving is often just them continuing the same cycle, just with a different audience. The applause may still be there, but the meaning is not. And over time, that gap between appearance and reality becomes harder to ignore, even for them. So if you're sitting with the pain of feeling like they walked away untouched, understand this: an empty victory is still empty, and no amount of external validation can compensate for a life that lacks genuine connection. Another way karma quietly unfolds is through repetition. Not the kind that builds mastery or wisdom, but the kind that traps a person in the same dysfunctional loop over and over again. And this is one of the most defining features of narcissistic patterns. As Dr. Ramani Durvasula often explains, narcissism is not just a set of behaviors, it's a rigid personality structure. And rigidity does not lend itself to growth. So what does that look like in real life? It means the same charm you once experienced is deployed again on someone new. The same intensity, the same mirroring, the same promises. But just as predictably, the same devaluation follows. The same manipulation, the same inability to take responsibility. It's not a coincidence, it's a cycle. From the outside, it may appear as though they're moving forward, building new relationships, starting fresh chapters, but psychologically, they're not moving forward at all. They're repeating, and repetition without reflection is not evolution, it's entrapment. Healthy individuals, even after painful experiences, have the capacity to pause, reflect, and integrate what they've learned. They ask difficult questions. What did I miss? What can I do differently? How do I grow from this? That process, while uncomfortable, is what leads to change. Narcissistic individuals tend to bypass this entirely. Reflection threatens their self-image, so instead of examining their behavior, they externalize blame. Every failed relationship becomes someone else's fault. Every conflict becomes evidence that they were wronged, and because of that, nothing fundamentally changes. Over time, this creates a kind of relational shallowness. The connections they form lack depth because depth requires honesty, And honesty requires accountability. Without that, relationships become transactional, based on utility rather than mutual care. People are valued for what they provide, not for who they are. And eventually, others begin to sense that. They may not have the language for it, but they feel the inconsistency, the lack of emotional safety. This is where the pattern begins to catch up with them. Not necessarily in a dramatic, immediate way, but in a gradual erosion of meaningful connection. Relationships may start quickly, but they don't sustain. Trust is built and then broken. Intimacy is initiated and then avoided, and each time the same outcome reinforces the same internal narrative without ever challenging it. Meanwhile, you, on the other side of that experience, have the opportunity to step out of the cycle, to recognize the pattern, to name it, and to choose differently moving forward. And that distinction matters because while they remain caught in repetition, you have access to awareness. And awareness is the foundation of change. So when it feels like they've moved on and left everything behind, remember this: a person who repeats the same harm is not escaping consequences, they're living inside them. Another place where karma begins to reveal itself is in the slow unraveling of the image they work so hard to maintain. Narcissistic individuals are, in many ways, highly invested in perception. Are seen. Not just how they are seen, but how consistently they are seen in a very specific, curated way, confident, in control, admirable, even exceptional. And as Dr. Ramani Durvasula often points out, this is simply vanity. It's a psychological necessity. That image is what protects a very fragile internal world. But maintaining a false self is not a passive process. It requires constant management. It requires controlling narratives, shaping impressions, and often rewriting reality to ensure that the image stays intact. And that level of psychological labor is not sustainable over time, because reality, unlike perception, does not cooperate indefinitely. In the early stages, many people are drawn in by the charisma, the confidence, the apparent certainty. There's a coherence to the persona that can feel compelling, even reassuring. But as time passes, inconsistencies begin to emerge. Small at first, subtle contradictions, stories that don't quite align, reactions that feel disproportionate. And then, gradually, more visible fractures appear, patterns of blame, emotional volatility. A tendency to deflect rather than engage. This is where the mask becomes harder to hold in place. Not because they choose to take it off, but because it begins to slip. And when it slips, it creates a kind of cognitive dissonance for the people around them. The person they thought they knew doesn't quite match the behavior they're now witnessing. That Nance doesn't always resolve in the narcissist's favor. Over time, it leads to questioning, to distance, and sometimes to complete disengagement. What's important to understand here is that the narcissist often responds to this, not with reflection, but with escalation. If the image is threatened, they may double down, becoming more defensive, more controlling, more insistent on their version of reality. But that response, rather than repairing the image, tends to accelerate its deterioration, because authenticity cannot be forced and trust cannot be coerced. So the very strategy that once helped them gain admiration begins to work against them. The performance becomes harder to believe, the effort becomes more visible, and the gap between who they present themselves to be and how they actually behave becomes increasingly difficult for others to ignore. This is not always a dramatic collapse. Often it's quieter than that, a gradual loss of credibility, a subtle shift in how others engage with them. Fewer people willing to invest deeply, more interactions that stay on the surface. The admiration may still exist in pockets, but it becomes thinner, less stable. And for someone whose identity is built on being seen in a certain way, that erosion carries a psychological cost. Because when the image weakens, there's very little underneath it to provide a sense of grounding or continuity. So if you're wondering whether the truth ever catches up, whether the mask ever slips, It does slowly and often without announcement. And when it does, it reveals something far more fragile than the image ever allowed others to see. There's another dimension to this that often doesn't get enough attention, and that is the loss of what we might call meaningful supply. Not all validation is created equal. And if you were someone who showed up with empathy, patience, emotional presence, what you were offering was not just attention, it was depth. It was consistency. It was a kind of psychological nourishment that is actually quite rare. And as Dr. Ramani Durvasula often emphasizes, narcissistic individuals don't just seek supply, they seek reliable supply. When you were in that dynamic, you likely became a stabilizing force. You may have listened when others wouldn't. You may have forgiven when others walked away. You may have tried to understand, to accommodate, to hold the relationship together even when it was costing you. And while that may have been exhausting for you, for them, it created a kind of predictability. They knew how to access your empathy. They knew how to pull you back in. That level of access is not easily replaced. So when you step away, when you go no contact, or even just begin to disengage emotionally, it creates a disruption. Not always one they will openly acknowledge, but one that is felt, because what they lose is not just a person, but a particular kind of connection, one that allowed them to be inconsistent without immediate consequence, one that absorbed their volatility without demanding accountability. And here's where the illusion often breaks down. They may find someone new. They may reestablish that initial charm, that early intensity. But over time, the differences begin to show. Not everyone will tolerate what you tolerated. Not everyone will invest at the level you did, and not everyone will provide the same depth of emotional responsiveness. What replaces you, in many cases, is not equivalent. It's fragmented. Interactions that are more conditional. Connections that are more superficial. People who are quicker to set boundaries, quicker to disengage, less willing to stay through the cycles. And while the narcissist may continue to seek out new sources, the overall quality of that supply often diminishes. This is not stunted, and that always shows up on the surface. From the outside, it may still look like they are surrounded by people, still receiving attention, still maintaining a social presence. But the internal experience can be very different because the depth of familiarity, the emotional access, they're not quite the same. And that creates a kind of instability. Over time, this can lead to a constant search on a need to keep finding the next person who might offer what you once did. But because the underlying patterns haven't changed, that search becomes increasingly difficult. The connections don't last, the trust doesn't build, and the sense of being truly known or even tolerated at a deeper level becomes more elusive. So if you find yourself questioning your value in the aftermath of that relationship, it's important to reframe that narrative. You are not just another person in their life. You are a source of depth in a system that often operates on surface. And when that depth is gone, it leaves a gap that cannot be filled by quantity alone, because real connection is not interchangeable, and once it's lost, it cannot simply be replaced. And when you follow all of these threads to their natural conclusion, you arrive at what may be the most profound and often the most uncomfortable form of consequence. They are left with themselves. Not the image, not the performance, not the curated identity presented to the world, but the internal experience they spend so much energy trying to avoid. And as Dr. Ramani Durvasula often underscores, this is the core paradox of narcissism, the relentless effort to escape an inner world that never actually goes away. Narcissistic individuals are highly skilled at distraction. They fill their lives with noise. People, achievements, attention, conflict, anything that keeps them from sitting in stillness long enough to encounter what's underneath. Because underneath the grandiosity is not confidence but fragility. Not self-assurance but insecurity. And not fullness but a kind of chronic emptiness that is difficult to articulate, even to themselves. When you were in that relationship, part of what you may have been doing, often without realizing it, was buffering that experience for them. Your presence, your attention, your willingness to engage gave them something to orient around. It helped keep that inner distance, so when you step away, it's not just a relational loss, It's the removal of a coping mechanism. Now, that doesn't mean they suddenly become self-aware or begin a journey of introspection. In many cases, they will continue to avoid that internal space. They may double down on external pursuits, seek out new distractions, or intensify old patterns. But avoidance is not resolution. And over time, the effort required to maintain that avoidance increases. Because here's the reality: you cannot run other people, but you cannot outrun yourself. There are moments, often quiet, often fleeting, where the distractions fall away, where the external validation isn't immediately available, where the noise subsides just enough for something else to surface. And in those moments, what they encounter is not the powerful, untouchable identity they project, but something far more unstable. A sense of disconnection, a lack of grounding, an absence of true self-understanding, and without the tools or willingness to engage with that experience, it remains unresolved. It lingers. It shapes their interactions, their reactions, their decisions, often in ways they don't fully recognize. This is why the patterns persist, not just because they choose them, but because they don't have access to anything deeper to replace them with. Meanwhile, your path, though painful, offers something fundamentally different: the capacity to reflect, to grieve, to understand, and ultimately to rebuild a sense of self that is not dependent on external validation, but grounded in awareness and authenticity. So while it may seem at times like they have escaped consequence, what they are actually living with is a kind of internal exile, a life disconnected from the very things that create meaning, stability, and genuine peace. And that is not something anyone else can fix, fill, or carry for them. Because at the end of it all, the one place they cannot leave is the one place they've never learned to truly face, and that is themselves.